And today we're going through the flood narrative. We're not going to read the story because it's a story that pretty much everybody knows, right? Whether you're a Christian or not. I'll give a brief recap of it, but it's a very, very familiar story to us, and it's so familiar that sometimes its importance can be lost on us a little bit. So we've spent the last 2 weeks talking about the build-up to the biblical flood, why it happened, why God judged the way that he does, why it's right, proper, and just for God to judge the earth. And today we're going to talk about the mechanism by which he judged the earth and why he did it the way that he did. So the first passage we're going to read is Genesis 6, verse 17 through 18. And actually, I shouldn't have even told you guys to pick up your Bibles because you're going to be flipping back and forth. It doesn't make any sense. But you can if you want. If you're dedicated and you want to flip back and forth, you go for it. But we're going to start in Genesis 6, verse 17. God is speaking to Noah, and he says, "Behold, I myself am bringing flood waters upon the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." So this is the means by which God preserves the human race through the line of Noah. And I want to address a bit of an inter-church conflict that occurs over this passage. Right? So if you're what's called a young earth creationist, that means that you believe that the earth is about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And the way that you account for the appearance of the world being very, very old, namely like the fossil record and some of the large bodies of geological bodies like the Grand Canyon and things like that, is actually through a global flood. That's how most young earth creationists hold to their viewpoint, even though the geological record seems to be against them. And it's interesting. If you want more information on that, you could look up guys like Ken Ham that gives a defense of what they call catastrophism, right? That a catastrophic event like the global flood might account for the appearance of age within the world. But then there's old earth creationists who believe that the earth is closer to what modern scientists would say. They believe that it is a couple billion years old, and they believe the human race is, I think, about 80 to 100,000 years old. And what they say is that this flood is actually a localized flood. Now, don't let that confuse you. That doesn't mean that they think it's just like over a city or something like that. They actually believe it was a catastrophic event that would have wiped out human civilization as it existed at that time. Right? So this is actually a flood that would cover roughly the area that we would call today the Middle East. And through this event, there was the creation of the Black Sea. So it's really interesting. You can listen to guys like Hugh Ross if you want more information on that. But what I've always been emphasizing throughout these talks is that, number one, this is a bad reason for Christians to divide over, and historically we have. And number two, because we've focused so much time on historically what occurred during this event, we've missed the more important symbolic elements. So what we could all agree on as Christians is that this is a historic event. It was a catastrophic historic event. It was something that God caused, and that it was so big, so important, that not only does it stick in the consciences of all mankind, right? Because I've talked about this before, over every continent, there is a flood myth, right? There is some sort of a flood story of God or the gods wiping out the earth and preserving humanity through a single family on an ark. That's significant. There's over 200 of these across the world. That means that there's probably a historical basis for it, number one. And number two, there's definitely a symbolic basis for it. There's something in the consciences of men that speak of the flood. So we're going to look at what did ancient men think of the flood narrative. And this includes the Jews. How did they see this event, and why was it significant to them? Because for them, they weren't really thinking about the mechanism that God used or exactly what happened. They were thinking about, why did God do this? And what does it mean for us? So in order to answer that question, we're going to turn to a guy who's not a Christian. He's a Romanian historian, wrote a very interesting 3-volume set called A History of Religious Ideas. It's a bit academic. I don't fully recommend it. But in it, he goes through all of the historical religious ideas that have developed in human civilization. His name is, and I know I'm pronouncing this wrong because I'm a Yankee and he's French, Mircea Eliade. I'm pronouncing it more like if he's Spanish, I don't know. But anyway, in this book, he does talk about flood myths and what it symbolized for ancient man. So this is what he says. However, if we examine the myths that in other cultures announce the coming flood, we find that the chief causes lie at once in the sins of men and the decrepitude of the world. By the mere fact that it exists, that is, that it lives and produces, the cosmos gradually deteriorates and ends by falling into decay. This is the reason why it has to be recreated. In other words, the flood realizes at the macrocosmic scale what is symbolically affected during the New Year festival, the end of the world and the end of sinful humanity in order to make a new creation possible. So there was an old word for this. It's actually come back into vogue, I guess you could say, through the Loki series, Ouroboros. So in the new, if you've seen the Loki series, right? one of the characters played by the kids from the Goonies, his name is Ouroboros. And if you Google that later, you'll see a picture of a snake eating its own tail, right? And that was a symbolic representation by ancient man of how the earth dies and recreates itself through cycles of rebirth, right? So every season you have that, right? In the winter, we have nature die, and then you have it come back in the spring. And also in the new year, as Mircea says, in the new year, we have the end of the world, basically. That's what the new year represents. We're all celebrating the world coming to an end so that we could start afresh in the new year. That's why we all come up with, New Year's resolutions that we don't actually keep. But, it's tradition, so we all try to do it anyway. The idea is that we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that's decaying and dying. And so because we live in a world that decays and dies, everything in it is subjected to that same level of decay. And so it's in desperate need of rebirth. So in order to make what he's saying and what I believe God is trying to communicate to us in Genesis 6 and 7, let's take it at an individual level, and then we're going to move up into a societal level. So as an individual, you go through phases of existence that are good in the moment, but if you expand them out too far, they become decaying and corrupting to the point where it's no longer good for you. So it's good that right now, right, my daughter lives on the total subsistence of myself and my wife, right? She doesn't make her own decisions. She relies upon us for her food, her sustenance, right? Everything in her life is given to her by me and my wife. That's good. That order of things, that world that we inhabit, will eventually decay. So she's 35 years old, and she's still asking me and my wife for what time it's good for her to go to bed, or whether it's good or not to have chocolate milk with dinner. Something's gone seriously wrong. And all of you would look at me and be like, this world needs to end, right? This world's got to end. You guys got to rebuild a new world, right? You're going too long, and because you're going too long, you're decaying at a really unhealthy level, and it needs to end, and it needs to come back into life. And that makes sense because the flood itself is representative of what water is representative of. So when ancient man looked at water, what they saw is they saw a shifting entity, a shifting body. Therefore, they believed it represented chaos and potentiality. And it's also something that you could draw life out of, right? You could go and you could fish. You can also bring the water out. You could drink the water. It's life-sustaining. It's cleansing. You could wash yourself with the water, but it's also dangerous. You could drown in it, right? It could flood your world. And the idea there is that the flood waters represent God bringing back over the land the raw, chaotic potential of the waters so that he could start anew, right? So he could bring a new world out from it. And whenever you go from one phase of life to the next, that it feels like that. It feels like the chaotic waters have kind of gone over your world and you don't know how to function, right? So when you're a kid and you move out for the first time and you have to learn how to take care of yourself, you go through a time of chaos where you don't know what to do. And that's why a lot of kids, their first year of college is a total waste, right? And they have to kind of get back together the next year. A lot of parents too, when they become empty nesters, they find in themselves like, I don't know what to do anymore. They can feel meaningless. They can feel like they don't have a purpose because their old world has ended and they're now in a new world. They have to learn how to function and inhabit this new world that they've come into. That's the idea of death and rebirth. That's the Ouroboros, right? Family, same thing, right? When you're in a family, again, the roles that you play within a family are going to change. You go from being a kid to being an adult where you're more like a peer with your parents to starting your own family. And then your parents take on the role of grandparent, right? So these roles are always dying and rising again through this process that God has us in. Societies work the exact same way. Every society, as it grows, it ends up becoming corrupted. And because it becomes corrupted, it's in need of this kind of washing, right? It needs to eventually have a flood happen so that a new world can start over. So if you study societies, you see that. You see that they have like a golden era where everything's great, and then they start to decay and they become oppressive and tyrannical, or they just fall into anarchy and chaos. And then another culture comes in, wipes them out, basically, and starts again, right? A new culture begins from the ashes of the old one. This is a really interesting concept, but what it means is that ancient society saw the floodwaters as both good and bad. It's bad in the sense that the world needed to be cleansed, but it's good in the sense that it is cleansed. It has to happen, otherwise the decay will actually become overly destructive. And in mankind, we've come up with myths and tales and stories that represent what infinite decay would look like. And we all agree that it's a bad thing. If you ever watch a zombie movie, that's what a zombie movie's about, right? You may not have thought of it, but that's what it's about. It's infinite decay. It's a corpse. It's something that's dead, and so it can't grow anymore, right? It's not developing. And it's just this dead husk that's walking around without any thought, and it's decaying infinitely. And when we think about infinite decay, it usually makes us feel a little gross, because that's, we want decay to end. If something's rotting, you want it to eventually come to an end so that something else can take its place. I don't know if any of you guys have smelled a dead body. I have. Unfortunately, it's the worst smell ever that there is, right? A decaying body, there's nothing worse than that. So again, think about what that would look like if decay didn't have an end. And if you start to conceptualize that, then you'll begin to understand what the Bible means by hell. Hell is a place of infinite decay. This is how it's described in Isaiah 66, verse 24. For their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. Hell is a place where there's no more growth, there's only decay, and it goes on forever. There's no end to the decay. The worm doesn't die, right? It's a really, really gross picture, but that's what the biblical authors are trying to convey. It doesn't sound like it. It's a blessing to us that God has allowed us to die in our current state. We don't think of it that way because death is something that we all fear. But if you were allowed to live forever in your current fallen state, your existence would turn into an hell. That is what hell is. It's God just allowing you to live forever in your current fallen state. It's a good thing that God allows us to die. It's a good thing that God allows societies to die, cultures to die. Because if they didn't, again, their pollution will spread outwards. If you want to watch a movie that understands this really well, watch Batman Begins, right? That's the whole plot of Batman Begins is the League of Shadows sees themselves as the floodwaters, right? They go into decaying societies and they end them before they could become too corrupt. And we'll talk a little bit later about why they're wrong, because it's actually important what we're talking about, right? You need to know when a society, right, when a world is worth preserving and when a world is not worth preserving. It's a very important thing for us to understand as Christians. The biblical authors saw it the exact same way, which makes sense when we look at things like baptism, why we're baptized. So 1 Peter 3, verse 18 through 22 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water." It's a very important phrase. I'll talk about it in a second. "There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth from the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven, that is at the right hand of God, and angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him." So how is Peter looking at the cross? He's looking at it as a flood. He's saying Jesus went into death. He went submerged into the grave, that he might be resurrected, brought out in newness of life through Christ. And so when he looks at the flood waters of Noah, he uses a really weird phrase. He says that Noah and his family were saved through the water. He doesn't say they were saved from the water, which is what we would assume he would say. He says that he was saved through the water. The waters saved Noah and his family. Why? The culture that he was in was so corrupt that if God would not have washed them from the face of the earth, they would have killed Noah and his family. God used the waters to save Noah. And this theme comes up throughout your Bible. This is why Moses is put in a little basket and put through the Nile rivers. It's the water that saves him. This is why Israel, when they go into the desert from Egypt, they pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and the waters come back crashing upon Pharaoh and his army. Right? So this theme comes up over and over and over again in your Bible because this is how ancient man saw the waters. So if you go to the baptism class later, I'll talk more about this. But that's why baptism becomes a sacrament for the Christian faith. Right? We're saved through the waters, through God washing us, cleansing us of our old life and the sins that were corrupting us. He raises us anew in a new life that is lived unto him and his purposes. We're saved through the waters, which gives us our first hint as to what it means to survive the flood, right? How do we prepare for floods in our life, and how do we actually make it through them so that they become good as opposed to being destructive for us? Real quick, I want to make a point about our current age. So if you notice, the reason why I'm saying this to you guys is because our current culture doesn't see the floodwaters this way anymore, right? So if I were to talk to a pagan, someone who lived 1,000 years ago, and be like, hey, this is what the floodwaters mean, and this is why we're baptized, they'd be like, totally, for sure, because all pagans had baptism rituals. They'd be like, absolutely, that's how we see the floodwaters. Modern culture doesn't see the floodwaters this way anymore. Why? There's certain reasons. Part of it is a pollution of Christianity. As Christians, we believe that this cycle of death and rebirth will come to an end. Jesus will return and set up an everlasting kingdom. But the other reason is because of our modern belief in evolution. So if you think about it, the ancient cultures didn't have a view of evolution. They believed that all things run down, they all die, and they decay. So in other words, they start from a more perfect state, and over time, they degrade into a less perfect state. Evolution teaches the opposite. It teaches that time doesn't have a degrading effect. Time has a renewing effect. Right? So over time, things get better and better throughout change. This is why in our political situation, there are people called progressives, right? They believe that culture is actually getting better and better. Any change that happens, they see it as positive, that we're evolving, we're becoming better, right? So if a lot of people are looking at our current cultural moment like, whoa. I think we're going a little too far, guys. Like, maybe we should take a step back. The people who are progressive, they believe, no, we're just changing into something new, right? Like, it's a good thing. We're just going to progress and progress and progress until it's utopia. Whereas we look at it and we're like, we're moving, but I think we're decaying. We're changing, but I think we're decaying. I hate to be quoting all these comic book movies, but that's just what I do. In the Avengers movie, which came out in like 2012, Captain America represents like America. He's awesome. When they bring him up, he has this great line where he says, they brought me out of the ice when we were fighting Nazis. And when I came out, they said that we won, but they never told me all that we lost. Right? That's the heart of the preserver. It's the heart of the person who realizes that change that happens isn't necessarily a good thing. We might have to preserve certain things in order to save what we can, which is what Noah represents. So Genesis 7, verse 1 through 2, it says this: the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you seven each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. What is that? Well, again, I think that there's a historical moment that this actually happened, but what it really represents for us is it represents Noah taking, if you want to word it this way, taking what works from his current world and preserving it for the one to come, if you want to put it that way. All right, so think again about a marriage, and I'm going to use a different metaphor this time. So when a couple gets married and they end up having kids, that's a flood, right? It's a big flood, right? Your world ends and it starts again, hopefully, And when it ends, sometimes as a marriage counselor, I see this all the time, where the couple goes through that period of chaos, especially since they're sleep deprived and kind of hating life a little bit, but loving their child. They can't find their footing anymore, and if they're not careful, they might lose what was working about their relationship, right? So they stop investing in one another. They stop going on dates. They stop pursuing romance and things like that, and they allow that part of the relationship to die. And now their new world only surrounds their kids. And that becomes an unstable world, both for them and for their children. And that unstable world will probably end again, unless they can learn how to save or preserve what was good about their relationship before the child and bring it into the new world, right? That's how this works, right? Whenever you go through a period of change, a flood hits you, you got to know what worked about what I was doing before. And how do I bring that into my new world? Because if you don't, like I said, you're going to end up creating a new crisis and your world's going to end again. This is a problem with the modern progressive ideology. The modern progressive ideology is everything that happened before us was terrible and awful, and thank God that all those people are dead, right? Let's just build something on their corpses because they can't teach us anything. That's that line of thinking. Like I said, you're different than the people who came before you, but different doesn't always mean better. Simply being different doesn't mean you're actually better. Just as a corpse is different than a live body, but that's not better, right? It's changed, but it's changed in a negative way. So Noah, having this heart, allows for him to be preserved in the flood, not only because he wants to preserve himself, but he knows what is important to preserve from the world that he inhabited. And I'm going to give you 3 words. All right, so whenever we're facing a flood, and why I think this is very profitable for us to study right now, is the people that I talk to nowadays, no matter which side of the political aisle they happen to be on, I think we all feel that a flood is coming. Something's happening in our world right now. We all feel this is kind of the end of things. Now, some people believe it's the end of everything. Maybe they're right. I don't know. But other people believe it's just the end of something. And a new world's going to come out of this. And if we want to make sure that the world that comes out of this is better than the world that's ending, we have to have the heart of Noah. We have to have the heart of Noah as Christians. So there's 3 ways to approach a flood. There's the complacent way, there's the revolutionary way, and then there's the reforming way. The complacent way is just, I'm going to stick my head in the sand, everything's good. Right? Everything's good, everything's fine. I don't believe anything is wrong. The revolutionary way is things are bad because everything down to the root is bad. And therefore we need to burn the world down, right? Everything that's come before us, we need to absolutely destroy, because anything that we create afterwards will be definitionally better than what came before, right? That's the revolutionary. The reformer is Noah. They're looking at the world and they're saying there are good and beautiful things about what exists now, and how do I save them for the world to come? Okay? And we'll go more over that in a second. What's the first thing we should be trying to preserve? Our own souls. Mark 8, verse 36 through 37, Jesus says this, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" This understanding of the flood has to begin at an individual level. If it doesn't, you will turn into a revolutionary. Right? Jesus said, before you try to pluck the speck out of your neighbor's eye, first examine the plank that is within your own eye. If you are just being moved by what's happening in our cultural moment, the flood is already sweeping you away. And even if you live through what's coming, you may not like the person you become as a result. This is from Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Jewish guy who lived through the Holocaust. He lived through 2 different concentration camps, which is impressive. And his book is really profound. I'll put it that way. It's a very profound book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. In the beginning of the book, he prefaces it this way, though. On the average, only those prisoners who could keep alive, who after years of trekking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest or otherwise, even brutal force, theft, and betrayal of their friends in order to save themselves. We who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. If all you're looking to save is your own skin, you may not be someone worth saving by the end of this. Okay? When we see floods happen, whether at the individual level or the societal level, people who are just focused on how do I make it through this, they make it through, but they lose something that is more important. They lose their souls. And that's what Jesus is warning about. Right? If you want to understand the ministry of Jesus, you have to understand it as being at the precipice of a flood. Right? Everyone knew a flood was coming. They just believed that Jesus was the ark. And he was, right? Jesus was the ark. But he was the spiritual ark. They thought he was the physical ark. They thought he was going to defeat the Romans. He was going to build a new world in Jerusalem. He didn't do that. Everything Jesus is warning about is he's saying, hey, look, guys, there's a flood coming. Rome is going to come in here and they're going to wipe out Jerusalem. And if you don't understand that and you're not aware of what's going on, you will be swept away by this coming flood. Either physically or spiritually, you will become corroded in your soul and you will lose what it means to even be a person. All right, so the first thing we should look at is, what are we trying to preserve? Am I trying to preserve my soul through this or just my body? There's an interesting sequence if you've ever read 1984. Right, in 1984, Winston's the main character and he's under this totalitarian regime, right? This Stalinistic evil regime. And he basically decides that he's going to overthrow the current state of things. And one of the government officials who's entrapping him, but he didn't know it at the time, sits down with him and he basically says to him, hey, like, what are you willing to do to topple the government? And Winston says, anything. He says, would you lie to overthrow the government? He says, yes. Would you kill to overthrow the government? Yes. He says, would you murder innocents just so that we could frame the government for doing it? And he says, yes. And later on, when he's being tortured, they play back that audio to him to show him, like, you think you're better than us? Like, you're willing to do anything it takes. You're willing to kill children to stop us? Like, what makes you think that the world you're going to build is so much better than the one that we have? The second you think that anything would be better than what we have right now, and I will do anything it takes to preserve what I want, you may not like the person you become at the end of that. The first thing you have to focus on is your own soul. God, what about me needs to die? Right? What about me is participating in the corruption of the world that I live in? And allow it to die so that the soul that you've given me, the one that was made in your image, can be made new, to be made fresh. That should be what we're doing. So many people today are looking out for salvation. They're looking for a movement. They're looking for a political figure. They're looking for some salvific entity to come out of the clouds and to save us from what's going on. And they have never considered that the power that we have to preserve our own souls already has been given to us by our great Savior, Jesus Christ. If only we're willing to cling to it, right? And that's really what we need. Next, what is the heart of the reformer and how does this work? So once we realize, like, I need to reform myself first, I'm going to clean up my own life first before I even look outward. Okay, what does the heart of the reformer look like? Let's look at a failing marriage to understand this. Okay, this will help. So a failing marriage. Usually marriages, they don't end in like these great cataclysmic ways, right? Sometimes it is something like that, an affair or something like that. But usually there are precursors to it. So even in my time of counseling couples that come back from an affair, what you realize is that a lot of things preceded the affair. It didn't just come out of the blue. Something was going wrong, and that was just kind of the end, the conclusion to what was already going wrong. So what usually you start seeing happen in couples is you just start seeing bad habits magnified over years. Right? It could be an inability to reconcile conflict. Right? It could be a bad attitude. It could be a failure to focus on the little things. It could be elevating other things in your relationship that you ought not to be. Right? But whatever it is, it starts to slowly erode the relationship. And then over time, you have to approach what's going on with one of these three attitudes. So the complacent attitude is the person who's going to deny that anything's wrong no matter what. So even when the relationship has become so caustic, so toxic, so awful, that anyone who even comes in close contact with you guys feels gross, right? Like that your relationship is so fractious and awful that anyone who becomes a part of your world wishes that they weren't, right? That's really bad. The complacent person will never admit to this eventuality. They'll pretend that things are good when they're really, really bad, and they won't say anything about it. The revolutionary is the person who looks at the problems and locates all of their problems into their partner. And they say, the reason why I'm unhappy is because of you. I was this happy, vivacious, amazing person, and then I met you, and you ruined my life, and then everything that's wrong with the relationship is you, and you're just horrible, monstrous demon that's completely deceived me and ruined everything. And usually they carry that chip on their shoulder for the rest of their life. And any problem that comes up later on, any relational difficulty, they're like, it's my ex. They really screwed me up. It just becomes a constant thing, right? That's the revolutionary. I'm going to locate all my problems outward. And therefore, I'm not worried about preserving anything from this relationship because everything about it is toxic and evil and bad. And I just need to hit reset and move on, right? That's the revolutionary. The reformer is the person who does that deep soul searching. What am I doing wrong in this relationship? How am I contributing to its decay? And I'm going to work on that. And I'm going to do everything I can to work on that. And then I'm going to look at my partner, and instead of seeing them as the problem, I'm going to try my best to see what in them is worth preserving. Right? What is good about them? Why did I marry them in the first place? Is there something worth saving in this relationship? Is there something worth saving in my partner? And then when you address the problems, you're not addressing them as the revolutionary who's like, we got to burn it all down. You're addressing it kind of like a surgeon would address you if you had cancer. Right? When a surgeon addresses you when they have cancer, if they have any bedside manner whatsoever, they're not going to come to you and be like, man, you're a mess. I think we just need to hit the reset button on you, buddy. We just need to wipe you out because you just are terrible. You're in horrible shape. Hopefully when they're going to look at you and be like, your life is worth preserving. You have something in you that's bad, and I'm going to do everything I can to get it out. I'm going to use whatever means necessary to get that thing out of you, but I'm going to use the least necessary force to do so. Right? They don't just jump to let's cut half your body off because you got a little tumor. They're going to go through steps to be like, I want to preserve as much of you as I can. And I'm going to go through every step I can so that we could save what we can. But eventually you realize I'm going to have to lose some stuff in order to make it through this. That's how the reformer addresses the problem in their life. What is worth saving and how do I address it? And I can always tell when I'm doing marriage counseling what attitude people are coming at it with. Right? If they come at it and they're like, hey, scale 1 to 10, how's your relationship? And obviously they're seeing me, so it's not a 10. But they say a 10, I'm like, okay, you're deluded, right? There's something, you're complacent. There's obviously something wrong, right? And their partner's like, I have a 1, and they're like, oh, it's a 10, it's perfect. It's like, no, it's not. Okay, you need to get real. There's something off in your thinking. But then if I go into a couple and there's minor things happening, and they're like, it's a 1, I'm ready to divorce right now. I'm like, okay, there's also something wrong with that. What I'm looking for is the person who comes in, they're like, we have a 3, maybe a 4. There's real problems here, but it's not beyond saving. I believe we can do the work. I believe we can salvage this relationship. That's the heart of the person that's going to make it through the flood. There's another thing that's really interesting about this passage is notice it lasts 150 days. And there's significance there. There's 40 days where it's raining, And there's 150 days in which the flood waters persist. Psychologically, it takes a little over a month to defeat a bad habit. It takes about 6 months to make a good habit stick. That's why your New Year's resolutions always fail, right? because they take more than a month to get them in your bones and your soul, right? You got to practice something for about 6 months before it takes root. So Noah and his family, they have to weather the storm for a little over a month, right? They have to wait for the world to end. And then they have to wait another 6 months, right? What do you think they were doing for those 6 months? Right? It's just them on the ark. That's all they got. It's a lot of time to think. What went wrong? What could we do better? That's the kind of thought that's going to get you through to the other side. It takes time, though. So many people don't make it through the flood because they give up. All they see is chaos. All they see is disorder, and they don't know how to make it through, and they give up before they had a chance to see the miracle on the other side. So the heart of the reformer is always looking. What can be preserved? What is God doing? And how do I participate in that? And ironically, it is only the reformer that can actually tell you when a world is beyond saving. Noah's world was beyond saving. The only thing he could save were the animals and his family. That's it. And yeah, that's a pretty good deal. Right? If that's all you can save, at least you saved your family. At least you saved some animals. That's pretty cool. But he couldn't save anyone else. Couldn't save anyone else. I watched a really disturbing movie last night. It's called The Zone of Interest, if you want to watch it. It's very disturbing, though. But it's disturbing in a way you wouldn't think. So what it's about is it's about the guy, and it's Rudolf Haas, I think is what his name was, but he was the guy who ran Auschwitz. And him and his family live. So the movie takes place, and it looks like a family film, basically. Right? It begins with them on the lake, and they're hanging out, and then they're in their house, and it's like a day in life up, right? It doesn't seem weird or disturbing or anything like that. But in the background, because their house is on the Auschwitz camp, and it's beautiful, you hear noises throughout the movie, and that's the disturbing part. You hear gunshots, and you hear screaming, and the family has just tuned it out. Right? They're just like eating dinner and they're hanging out and they're talking about innocuous stuff. And the whole time, and you just feel it as you're watching it because you know what those sounds are. And it's really disturbing because of that. What it's about, what that movie is about, is how a society can become so corrupt that any participation in it, corrupts you. There's a time where a world becomes so bad that any amount, just touching it a little bit, will be corrosive to your soul. In Revelation 18, verse 4, it says this, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive her plagues.'" Saying this city, this last days empire is so bad that if you participate with it at all, it will corrupt you. This is what the mark of the beast is, by the way. Right? A lot of people debate, they're like, what the heck is the mark of the beast? The mark of the beast is the decision to stay in the economic system of the culture that's that corrupt. That's what it is. Now, is there a physical thing that's going to go on your hand? Maybe. I don't know. It's probably Amazon. I don't know. But at any rate, it's that decision to say, I'm going to stay in this system even though it's corrupting my soul. That's what that means. I'm going to stay in the system even though it's corrupting my soul. And that's what that movie's about. It's a family who's just living. They're not doing anything evil, but you know that they are. You know that they are doing something evil because they're participating in the evil that's around them. They're unwilling to speak up. And again, this is what makes, when I watched that movie last night, it finally made sense to me, a sequence in the Bible that I've always struggled with and I never fully grabbed. And it's the scene where the rich young ruler comes and talks to Jesus, and Jesus says, you got to sell everything, you got to give it away. And I knew just from my reading in the Bible that he can't possibly mean that we all have to do that. But why that guy? Why does he have to give up everything? And when I watched that movie, it was like, that's why. That's why. He's a part of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is so corrupt at that moment in history. It's so corrupt that it would crucify the Son of God. Any participation in it would have been corrupting to this person. Jesus is saying, you got to give it all up to follow me. If the Sanhedrin was doing good, Jesus wouldn't have said that to them, right? It's just because they weren't doing good. It's like, dude, if you're a part of this thing in a couple years, maybe 2 years, you're going to have to vote on my execution. And you're going to vote yes. That's what should really grip us as Christians. Already, we could look out and we could say, are there areas of our culture that we can't participate in? The answer is absolutely yes. But is the world beyond saving? I don't think it is. I really don't. I think that there's a reformation that could happen. I think that there can be a reformation of our current cultural moment. But we're not going to get there through complacency. We're not going to get through there by burying our heads in the sand and pretending like everything's okay. It's going to take a lot of work. And the only people who are going to be able to make it to the other side and say, yeah, it's finally reached that point and make the right decision at the right moment are the people who are fighting their hardest to save what they can. That's why Peter warns us. He says, in regard to these things, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of it. Like, there's a force to corruption. It's a flood. It could sweep you away. Not only in participating with it, but in becoming something else. Some people are swept away in a different way. What Jesus was worried about his disciples is not they're going to become like the Sanhedrin members, because they had no temptation of that. What did they have the temptation to become? Violent revolutionaries. Right? In the moment of his arrest, what does Peter do? He tries to cut the head off the high priest's servant, Malchus. Luckily, he had terrible aim, and he only cut off his ear. But that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to murder that guy. Because he's like, I'm not going to let this happen. We're going to rise up. We're going to throw down the people who are corrupting our culture. He was vulnerable to becoming an agent of hate and destruction. And the people who come from the other side, they're also being swept away by the flood of dissipation. But they don't see it because their flood is one of hate and not one of licentiousness. So we must be very careful. We need to learn the lessons of Noah so that we're not swept away, so that we can honor God in what we do. Let's pray. Father, we love you and we thank you so much that even though this story is as old as human history, it has so much to teach us. And I pray, God, that we learn its lessons, that we learn to be people like Noah, we learn to be people that are seeking to preserve the world that we live in right now, that we would live in an honorable way to you and live to glorify you with every day and every beat of our heart. We're thankful for you, God, and in your name, amen. So as we take communion, once again,